Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 257. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. On today's show, I have news on Ukraine, Syria, and a case of torture at the hands of U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. So I'll be breaking all that down on today's show. Share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. And as I've been talking about on the show for the past week or so, right now at the Institute, we are hosting our spring fundraiser. So if you would like to go over and help to support the work that I'm doing with this show, with the writing that I'm doing, covering the news from a libertarian perspective at the Institute, please go on over today and donate. It would really help, us to continue the work that we're doing. It's of course myself, Scott Horton, Sheldon Richmond, Keith Knight, Connor Freeman is a writer there who's of course the co-host on this podcast. Will Porter regularly writes with me in the news section or has his own articles at the Institute. And again, things happen in the world, and most of the time you have to rely on Fox News, CNN, or whoever to go and read it and try to read through what they're saying to pick out the truth. And at the Institute, you really don't have to do that because we just cut through all the propaganda to give you what you need to know. So if you want to support that kind of work, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. You can also find the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version, Facebook and Twitter for social media. Twitter handle is @con_interest. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. And then the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, palomaverdecbd.com. Promo code PEACE. That saves you 20% when you spend $75 or more, and it gets the show a kickback. All right, now let's get into the news today. And the first story I want to talk about is an article that myself and Will Porter wrote for the Institute, and it is titled, "Not Just Sending Our Prayers, Australia Announces New Military Aid to Ukraine." And this is from April 1st. Australia is set to transfer Bushmaster armored vehicles to Ukraine. Prime Minister Scott Morrison said filling a request from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made just one day prior. Though the premier did not specify how many vehicles would be sent or give a timeline for the deliveries, he unveiled a new $25 million aid package during a Friday press conference, suggesting it would include more than just the Bushmasters. "We are not just sending our prayers, we are sending our guns, we're sending our munitions, we're sending our humanitarian aid, we're sending all of this body armor," Morrison said, adding, "We're going to be sending our armored vehicles, our Bushmasters as well." The Ukrainian leader requested the equipment by name during a speech to Australian lawmakers on Thursday, saying, "You have a very good armored personnel vehicles, Bushmasters, that could help Ukraine substantially," while also urging for tougher sanctions on Russia. Before the latest announcement, Canberra had already pledged or sent more than 68 million in military assistance on top of another 49 million in humanitarian aid, according to the Associated Press. Since Russia launched its invasion in late February, Zelensky has appeared before governments around the world to plead for additional aid and foreign intervention. In his speech to the Australian Parliament, he warned that the distant oceanic nation would not be safe from conflict if it escalated to nuclear war, accusing Moscow of blackmailing other countries with ICBMs. Zelensky has also tailored his message for local audiences, invoking 9/11 and Pearl Harbor while addressing the U.S. Congress and referencing the MH17 plane crash in his comments to Australian lawmakers. The civilian airliner went down under mysterious circumstances in 2014 amid the civil war in Eastern Europe, killing 38 Australian passengers and 260 others. New military aid from Canberra was announced shortly after UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace said Ben Wallace said allied countries were preparing to ship heavier weapons to the government in Kiev. Ukraine needs longer range artillery, and that's because of what the Russian army has been doing, which is now digging in and starting to pound these cities, Wallace told Sky News. The best counter to that is longer range artillery, so they will be looking for and getting more longer range artillery ammunition predominantly. And again, that is from the UK after he got off of a call with other allied member nations. And I believe I read this morning, well, I did read this morning, that Germany was sending their armored personnel carriers as well to Ukraine after a specific plea made by Zelensky. So these are some of the decisions and some of the transfers of what the West is doing right now involving Ukraine is really centered around weapons, not very much on diplomacy. I mean, if you look, the UK has under sanctions the Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich, who is the one kind of negotiating, at least in some way, between Russia and Ukraine at this point. And so it's just absurd at how we're militarily getting involved in this war and giving all these weapons to Ukraine, which I think are going to have very little battlefield implications. If you look at what's happening right now in Ukraine, Russia seems to be able to strike anywhere it wants to. And so if armored personnel carriers start rolling into Ukraine, my guess is that Russia just going to strike them. And how long can these things really last? Big question marks. Now maybe they figure Russia will choose not, if they space them out enough or something like that, Russia won't hit them because the missiles are more expensive than the personnel carriers. But again, my guess is that with the capabilities that Russia now has in Ukraine, these vehicles won't have any long-term survival ability even once they get there. And it's going to be a death trap for the Ukrainian forces, but it's also just going to provoke and elongate this war rather than, again, for these Western countries, maybe not Australia because it's not a NATO member state, but specifically, the US and UK, looking to negotiate with Russia to help Kiev, right? Like we could talk about moving, redeploying US and UK troops in Poland out of those countries in order to give, Ukraine some more leverage or things like, but there's none of that going on. In fact, the US is doing the opposite. And then, of course, the Financial Times reported that the US isn't even committing to lifting the sanctions if Russia withdraws its troops from Ukraine. And so even if that war ended tomorrow, then we're apparently going to keep the sanctions on until Vladimir Putin makes other concessions or something like that, stops all human rights abuses. What the U.S. will label as human rights abuses is just not going to happen. If Russia demanded that the U.S., we're going to sanction the U.S. until, we feel there's racial equality in America, then the U.S. will remain under sanctions from Russia. I mean, probably forever, because first of all, the Russian government will probably, invent propaganda or, exaggerate the situation at times, look to get involved and at times stoke tensions, which is what the U.S. does in Russia and in regions around the world, right? But at the same time, just it's within our own society that this is going on, and so outside pressure isn't going to make it go any faster. And that's just a very important thing that people need to remember, that that's the way these other countries I think generally look at this too. And that's why sanctions proven don't work. We have all these countries sanctions, it never moves their foreign policy at all. All right, let's talk a little bit more about military stuff, because the U.S. is going to keep the USS Truman, that's the aircraft carrier strike group, deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean because of what's going on in Russia. I recently quoted the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, in an article I wrote where he said that this aircraft carrier is currently under the authority or can be ordered to strike Russia by allied member nation states, not just the United States. And now I want to go through a few important articles from Dave DeCamp on the situation in Ukraine. This first article is titled Eastern Europe Considers Iron Curtain with Belarus to Isolate Russia. And Dave says Poland, Latvia, Lithuania are in talks with Ukraine to close their borders with Belarus to blot supplies that could go to Russia, Newsweek reported on Thursday. Ukraine's ambassador to Poland said Ukrainian officials have held talks with the Polish government on the matter. We're holding talks with the Polish Ministry of Infrastructure with the Polish government in order to completely close the border between Poland and Belarus, even if the decision is not taken at the level of the European Union, he said. The Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have also been involved in negotiations. Estonia doesn't share a border with Belarus, but does with neighbor Russia. We have appealed to these countries so that they simultaneously close their borders with Belarus and Russia, he said. And all right, he goes on. Since Russia and Belarus, as platformed to launch a part of this attack on Ukraine, the U.S. and its allies have been ramping up sanctions on Belarus. When asked about the potential plan to close the border, the spokesperson for Latvia's foreign ministry told Newsweek further sanctions and restrictive measures against Belarus are being considered. And this is, I think, just a small example of what the current U.S. and Western policy is doing with these sanctions, that they're not going to lift even when the war, even when the fighting ends, means that they're, building these barriers between the countries that choose to remain in economic relationship with Russia and those with the United States. And as time goes on, these the divide is going to grow. It's not going to shrink. There's right now no political interest at all in America in having any kind of detente or concern for Russians, not just, Vladimir Putin, but Russians at all. Right, Biden's calling for regime change. People are canceling Russians. Anybody who doesn't denounce the Russian government, who speaks slightly with a Eastern European accent, is being completely canceled. It's just absurd. And again, until there's some kind of interest in reversing this, then it's only going to get worse and worse and worse. And so this is a very concerning situation, I think, with the sanctions, and I'll talk a little bit more about sanctions in a minute here. But I want let's mention that Dave has this article: South Ossetia planning to hold a referendum to join Russia. South Ossetia is Georgia's breakaway republic, and it's on the border with Russia, and I think it's pretty much all Russian people that live there. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, this was an area that was went with Georgia, and so then it was independent or not independent, I guess it was autonomous with Russian peacekeepers. In 2008, Georgia invaded, and then Russia got further involved and since has existed as an autonomous breakaway republic and essentially under Russian protection. And so we have the president telling Al Jazeera, I believe that unification with Russia is our strategic goal, our path, the aspiration of the people. He went on to say, we will take the relevant legislative steps shortly. The Republic of South Ossetia will be a part of its historical homeland, Russia. And then a member of the Russian State Duma said a referendum will likely be held in May or June. Russia's news agency reported that South Ossetia is holding consultations with Moscow on the referendum. And so this is where it's not clear to me where this is originating from, whether it's in Georgia or in South Ossetia or in Russia. If it's coming from Russia, then I think it's very likely going to happen. If it's coming from South Ossetia, I'm not so sure that that's a move that Putin really is would be ready to make at this point. It seems like it could be an opportunity for the United States to then open up essentially another battlefield against Russia, and now on its southern border as well. And The U.S. Secretary, our State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, said that the U.S. will not recognize the results of any effort by Russia or its proxies to divide sovereign Georgian territory, which, if the people of South Ossetia really want to join Russia, I guess that, should be their own decision. It may provide a greater amount of security than they could possibly provide as their own little breakaway region. And so maybe they feel like it'll actually give them a little bit more autonomy to do so and not be quite so concerned about what decisions are being made in the Georgian leadership. All right, now on to the sanctions. IMF says Russian sanctions threaten to reduce dominance of U.S. dollar. This from Data Camp and Anti-War, March 31st. The U.S.-led Western sanctions campaign against Russian threats to chip away at the U.S. dollar dominance as the world's reserve currency, according to a top IMF official. The IMF first deputy managing director said the sweeping sanctions against Russia will lead more countries to making transactions in other currencies. The dollar would remain the major global currency even in that landscape, but fragmentation at a smaller level is currently quite possible. We are already seeing with some countries renegotiating in currencies which they will get paid for that trade. And this is something that I've talked about on the show for, I think, 5 years now. I've been doing this show and talking about this specific topic, that the more countries the U.S. sanctions, the more these countries are going to find ways to do business with each other. And so we've seen Iran increasing business with Venezuela and other countries trading either in gold or currency to currency, or just direct kind of bartering, swapping products, the way Iran has been bringing Venezuela these petrochemicals that helps Venezuela get its oil out of the ground. So this is this is all really important, and it could really affect the way that global business is done. And you do wonder if the people in Washington in the current Biden administration are so full of American dominance and superiority that they don't realize that they're really pushing closer and closer to this level, and it could create a situation where the U.S. ends up losing out big time, more than they should have, had they not put these sanctions on Russia and not done things like try to force India and Israel to take a side. Last article here from Dave DeCamp. U.S. targets Russia's technology sector in latest sanctions. On Thursday, the U.S. imposed new sanctions on Russia that target the country's technology sector and a network of companies Washington says it is working with to evade Western sanctions. The Treasury Department said the sanctions targeted 21 entities and 13 individuals, including Russia's largest microchip manufacturer and exporter of electronics. The Biden administration also determined that sanctions apply to Russia's aerospace, marine, and electronics sector. The determination means that any person operating in those sectors could be hit with U.S. sanctions. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, the U.S. and its allies have imposed a series of harsh sanctions on Russia. The measures have done nothing to stop the fighting and don't appear to be hurting Russian President Vladimir Putin. A recent poll found that Putin's approval rating has risen to 83% since the invasion started, up 71% since February. The ruble is also recovering from its initial hit that took when the U.S. started imposing sanctions, and the Russian currency is back up to its pre-invasion value. And so despite what you hear in the United States about how everything is going completely poorly for Vladimir Putin, that's just not the case. Now, one last thing on the sanctions is apparently Venezuela is leasing and buying a whole bunch of cargo ships in anticipation of the U.S. sanctions being lifted. Venezuela recently released 2 people that the American want released from prison. I think they were either dual American citizens, or one maybe was just a Venezuelan who was on the board of Citgo. But either way, Venezuela did release a couple of prisoners. And so it could be that this is a real sign that the sanctions on Venezuela are about to be lifted. Now, with that, of course, is all the damage it's done to the Venezuelan economy over the past 8 years, and for absolutely no reason at all, as we're now seeing, because nobody was actually serious about punishing Maduro, or this was in any way about doing the right thing for the Venezuelan people. It was just the U.S. Geopolitical power play, punishing Venezuela because we don't like the governments that the Venezuelan government is tied to. We don't like Maduro. We would prefer the Venezuelans let the U.S. sock puppet who will give more favorable trade deals with the U.S. But now that, we don't need that from Venezuela, we just need their oil, we're going to lift those sanctions. So anything that, all these, humanitarian interventionists have been crying about for the past 8 years again in Venezuela is absolute garbage. And it's really, I guess it's good that they're lifting sanctions, but the reason for it is almost so disgusting. It's infuriating. All right, a couple other things I want to talk about today before we wrap up. I have this article from the Libertarian Institute on March 29th. Islamic State attack on Syrian refugee camp leaves 4 dead. The Islamic State attacked a large refugee camp in American-controlled Syria. The battle between ISIS and the Kurdish forces left 4 dead, including a child. The Al-Hol refugee camp houses 60,000 people. Most of its inhabitants are displaced Syrians. It also contains a prison that holds 10,000 foreign nationals with alleged ties to the Islamic State. Many of these people are wives or children of alleged ISIS members and not actually alleged to have in any way fought for the Islamic State, although there is fighting that goes on in the camps, even among the women, or they're now teenage and adult children's, about ideology. And apparently there are some women there who are very committed to the Islamic State ideology. I don't know if they would go blow themselves up or anything like that, but believe in that type of Islamic jihad. The latest attack lasted for 3 hours and left 4 dead. Among the dead was a children and an Islamic State fighter. Violence is not new to the camp, which is primarily populated by women and children. In 2020, the UN reported 700 people had died in Al-Hol or the nearby Raj camp. Many of the deaths occurred in clashes between the Islamic State and U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. Half of the deaths were children, and some were caused by a lack of food and medical care. The SDF has demanded for years that governments repatriate their citizens, but European countries have resisted. Human Rights Watch says this has created a state of indefinite and arbitrary detention for the 10,000 prisoners. Residents of the camp report contaminated water, overflowing latrines, shortages of fresh food and diapers, tents, leaking or catching fire, rampant disease, insufficient medical care, and almost no schooling for children or counseling for severely traumatized people. And again, this is a camp that has existed for 5-6 years now. I think it was mainly just a prison camp up until the U.S. In 2019 routed the last of the Islamic State in a city along the Iraq and Syrian border where it meets with the Euphrates River. We would create tens of thousands of more displaced people and put them all around the prison in the Al-Hol camp. And that's created even more problems with I think the tensions between the more jihadist types and the, I guess, more just regular people, displaced people types. And so this is all really important that this is going on. And again, it's easy to blame the Syrian Kurds who run the camps and hold these people, but at the same time there are a lot of children now who have grown up with only wives of higher ranking ISIS members to educate them and influence them. And so if there's going to be a lot of problems from this, and I don't even want to begin to try to think out what the solutions could possibly be, other than the U.S. starting to, I guess, return the people who are Syrians, just Syrians who are displaced their home. That would be one thing, because this isn't U.S. occupied Syria. And it's important to remember that the U.S. specifically has sanctions on Syria to prevent that country from rebuilding from the civil war. So we're making sure that these people remain indefinitely displaced. And then once the Syrians have gone home, then I think the U.S. could put some political pressure on its allies and for ourselves to take back its citizens. Or I guess the other options to tell the Syrian government that we're not going to complain with what they do with them. And yeah, that may lead to some real human rights abuses. So I wouldn't recommend going in that direction. In the past, I would say like 3 or 4 years ago, there's a case where a lot of them were being moved back to Iraq, a lot of these women, and the Iraqi government was trying them 10, 11, 12 women at a time and sentencing them to hang. And then they're going to do this with a group of French women. And I almost think it was maybe a bluff on the part of the Iraqi government. Like, hey, like, you got to do something about this or we're going to take the extreme route. And I think that kind of put a stop to the Syrians sending the Iraqi women back. So, a report for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft by Ben Armbruster out March 31st, titled U.S. Quietly Releases Report on Civilian Casualties. All right, so the Armbruster article says earlier this month, the U.S. coalition aimed at combating ISIS quietly announced its first public assessment of civilian casualties in more than 8 months, tallying at least 1,437 civilians killed in operations since 2014, a figure far lower than estimates from non-governmental organizations. Without any accompanying press release or efforts at greater public awareness, the Combined Joint Task Force, or Operation Inherent Resolve, this is the U.S. and its allies' war that they're carrying out in Syria and Iraq against ISIS. Those are the different names they use for them. Said that it had analyzed 68 cases of suspected civilian casualties and found 10 credible, 53 non-credible, and 5 to be duplicates. OIR, that's the Operation Inherent Resolve, said that 18 civilians were killed and 11 injured in the 10 reports deemed credible. Air Wars, an NGO monitoring civilian casualties in armed conflicts groups, says that according to its assessment of the same incidents, that that casualty figures are likely far higher, between 45 and 166 civilians reported killed. Now, just real quick on Air Wars, this is a group that, looks at specific events. They're not looking at, this is the number of people that lived in Raqqa in 2014, this is the number of people in 2022, and based on that, we estimate that X number have died in various ways. They're looking at specifically U.S. airstrikes, specific claims made. So they're saying that, on, October 22nd of 2017, there was a strike in Raqqa, Syria that hit this house, and 4 people say they are witnesses to that. 2 of them have videos. One has some photos. They show that 4 or 5, people are dead. There's no evidence there's militants in the videos, and 3 of the dead are children. And so Air Wars, could say that there's a very likely case that, 5 civilians were killed there. Now look at maybe another situation. It's like December 13th, and there's a report airstrike in Raqqa, and 2 neighbors report that 3 civilians lived in that house, but there's no photos of bodies or anything like that, and so they would probably put that in the less likely category, and maybe not even in the high end figures that they give. Maybe if somebody has videos, then they are a photo or 2, then they would. And so, this is a group that's really looking and trying to break down like what happened on what day in this particular U.S. airstrike. And so these aren't to say these are the only people that are killed by the U.S., but the U.S. should be able to investigate this as well as an NGO, and it's absolutely appalling, that they do such a poor job compared to Air Wars. So Ben goes on to write, while the OIR released this month acknowledges 1,437 civilian deaths, Air Wars says that it is at least 8,192 and as great as 13,243 civilians that have been killed by coalition forces since the war on ISIS started. Air Wars also found irregularities in the OIR's explanations for the 43 incidents deemed non-credible. This is a statement from Air Wars. While we welcome the release of the civilian harm assessments, it is clear that there are still needs to be radical improvements in DoD processes. We will be seeking clarity in particular on the remaining 37 open cases will be reviewed, as well as information from DoD and their civilian harm assessment standards. And so that's a very important thing too. The DoD could just set standards that are so loose or so biased against the information that civilians in Syria could possibly turn up that makes it impossible for them to prove anything. One last thing I want to note here is Turkey has dropped the criminal investigation into Saudi Arabia's involvement in the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post journalist who was assassinated in the Turkish consulate or the Saudi consulate in Turkey back, I think, 2018 now? Those were quite a few years ago. And of course, the Saudis kill people all the time. The amount of Yemenis dead is nothing, compared to the amount of news coverage that the Khashoggi killing has gotten. So maybe this will draw a little bit more attention to that, especially as Biden is becoming more friendly with the Saudi government. The fact that he hasn't held them as a pariah state as he promised for things like the war in Yemen and the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. But at the same time, I guess is that this is just going to get dropped, and it's a really political opportune time probably for Saudi Arabia to have that happen. Nobody in the U.S. is going to complain about it, and most of the other media attention is elsewhere, particularly Ukraine. All right, now I want to talk about this story that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. It's one of the news stories I'm most I mean, the story's disturbing, but the way I wrote it, I'm very happy with the way it came out. So anyways, this one is titled Afghan Translator Alleges American Soldiers Tortured an Afghan Commando Before He Died, and it's from March 29th, 2022. A Department of Defense investigation into the death of an Afghan commando includes evidence the man was tortured while in U.S. custody and died hours later. 8 Green Berets received reprimands for their role in the soldier's death. In October 2022, on October 22nd, 2018, Wahidullah Khan opened fire on 3 Chet soldiers, killing Corporal Thomas Pagaza and wounding 2 others. Khan, an Afghan commando, was suspected of infiltrating NATO's training program, then carrying out an insider attack. Khan was arrested by Afghan forces and handed over to NATO, American, and Chet soldiers for questionings. Hours later, Khan was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma. A Pentagon report obtained by the Military Times through FOIA revealed some details about the American soldier's role in the man's death. An Afghan translator alleges he witnessed serious torture committed at the hands of Green Berets. The interrogation happened in a small room in the Sinadad Air Base. Americans told investigators that the location was selected to cut down on the number of witnesses. Once inside the room, the Americans allowed Chet soldiers to question Khan. The translator said during this time he heard screams coming from the room, and American soldiers were able to access Khan's phone. After Chet soldiers finished their questioning, the American translator entered and the American soldiers entered. A Green Beret told the DoD investigators the point of the interrogation was to find out if there were any more people or threats waiting. The translator then claims he witnessed what amounts to torture. He said the American soldiers zip-tied the detainee's hands, choked him, hit him in the crotch, slammed his head into objects, and brandished a knife while threatening to slit his throat. He also reported that the Americans witnessed a Chet soldier brutalizing Khan. The Chet soldier started choking the shooter and spitting on him. Grabbing his hair, he yelled at the shooter and pounded on the desk, the translator said. The DoD report said that The interrogation, the DoD report said after the interrogation, Khan was transferred to the custody of Afghan soldiers. A few hours later, he was brought to the hospital by Afghan soldiers without a pulse. American soldiers claimed Khan was unharmed by either U.S. or Czech forces. However, the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division said Khan's blood was found in the room used by the American and Czech soldiers. The report said the room appeared to have been cleaned. However, blood splatter was identified on the walls and ceiling. A laboratory announcement for the blood splatter revealed the blood matched the DNA profile of Mr. Khan. The translator said several Americans instructed him to lie about what happened during the investigation. 8 of the soldiers involved received written reprimands. Only 6 of the reprimands were permanent, and it was very quietly done. Nobody is facing criminal charges. They say it's because of the lack of evidence and the fact that Khan changed his story. Initially, after it happened, he only reported hearing the screaming when the Czech soldiers were in the room. Later, 2 weeks later, he revised what he said to include the torture committed at the hands of the Green Berets. Now, one very important thing here is the translator was threatened by the Americans not to say anything, and he had just witnessed them torture a man. So if he decided to lie, I'm not very surprised about that. And this is an absolute cover-up of torture committed at the hands of Americans. And let's get into the rest of this. So initial reporting of Khan's killing of a Czech soldier claimed he was a Taliban infiltrator who had carried out an insider attack or a green on blue attack. During the 30 minutes, Khan was interrogated by Americans. Khan said he was feeling sick and went crazy. One Green Beret said, again, we asked him who hired him to do this or why he did this, and he just insisted he lost his mind. However, during the torture, Khan did discuss one event. He said he had witnessed Americans killing 3 Afghan women in a mortar attack. A different Green Beret remarked. He claimed that Americans made mistakes all the time, and when they kill innocent civilians, and it was just all his mistake. He went on to elaborate on his comment that he just went crazy. And what this guy is saying is like, well, I made the same mistake that you guys made. I just went a little bit crazy, did something I shouldn't have done. Nobody should really be mad at me. Everybody should just move on with it. But that's obviously not how it works, and it seems very much like he was beaten to death by the Americans and Czech soldiers. The reports from one of the Afghan soldiers was that he was so bloodied by the time he was given back to the Afghans, they had put him in the back of the truck. And so it doesn't sound like he really had much chance of survival. 2 more stories on Afghanistan real quick. The UN is requesting a record $4.4 billion to feed Afghanistan in the coming years and to somewhat alleviate the hunger crisis. My guess is that the Afghans are not going to have that much more success than the Yemenis have in, gaining around first the American blockade and then the just lack of interest in helping poor people who are suffering because of the empire. The U.S. did announce $200 million in new humanitarian aid. This is going to be funneled through USAID. I guess as most of it don't get to the the Afghans most in need. And I'm guessing, but not positive, that the U.S. is stealing this money from the Afghan government's own accounts to give back to them, and what they really need to do is lift the sanctions and unfreeze the accounts. All right, that's the show for today. Hope everybody's enjoying it. I do want to point out here, I don't think this is a big deal. I'm recording this show a few hours before I put it out, like a day and a half. I got a few things to do this coming weekend, some personal stuff. So I am recording this on April 1st. I'll release it on April 3rd. But I don't think anything is going to be out of date. I think everything I covered is, will be fine for the weekend. And back with more shows on Tuesday. Everybody just keep checking out what I'm doing, following where I'm writing either at antiwar.com or the Libertarian Institute. Thanks, everyone.